Good evening, everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of Raising the Visibility. I am your host, Carl Evans, CEO of the Hope for Us Network. And today is May 26th, and we're happy for you to join us on this third episode in season 1 of Raising the Visibility. And, we're doing this work always in the goal of being proactive on mental health. And we're always going to be talking about topics that have a relationship not just to our personal selves, but to our community. And it would be sort of weird for us to, despite having this regularly planned episode, to not acknowledge the realities around what's been happening in recent weeks. And we're going to talk about it throughout the episode. It's not just that there's been another mass shooting in America. There have been numerous, more than 200 since the year 2022 began, but there's always incidents that seem to capture the attention in ways that just make it almost inescapable. And we consider any kind of content we put out here at the network as a space where we're holding the chance to have real conversations and to embrace self-expression. So it would be kind of remiss for us to not acknowledge that that's part of the environment and what's going on. So with that, this episode is titled Sexual Orientation. And I think it's kind of interesting that that's where we're starting tonight. Before we get into that, I just want to do a little housekeeping to sort of talk about the network at large. We just completed the Stream for Hope Cup 2022 last week, and I want to send a huge thank you to all of our participating streamers. We're tabulating the final results, and we'll be announcing a winner later this week. I want to thank all the viewers who dropped in on the different participating streamers who made the effort to use their voices and platforms to talk about mental health. It's very, very important, and we're super, super stoked to have seen our viewers migrate over and give viewership and support to these independent streamers who are doing their work, sharing their passions. And it's just a really exciting experience to have seen the sort of interaction and the cross-pollination of communities come together. So thank you to everyone in front of the camera and behind the camera who made Stream for Hope Cup happen. We consider it a huge success. And again, we'll be able to talk about numbers and impact maybe as soon as the end of this week, by tomorrow, or at the top of next week, we'll be announcing who the overall Stream for Hope Cup champion was. That said, we're going to just jump right into things. As usual, we start raising the visibility with a little bit of a presentation about some information, creating a sort of baseline. And proactive prevention, as you can recall from our different episodes, the goal being we need to start conversations that close down the gap between the onset of mental health challenges and the point at which we receive resources and treatment and support. So whether it's a diagnosable illness or an experience like trauma or psychological injury, we want to break down this sort of concealment gap in which people have something happen to them or they begin to experience mental health challenges and they conceal them through stigma. And there's this long gap in which they live in silence with those challenges. And it can be days, weeks, months, years, decades. And typically people don't arrive at getting support for their mental health challenges until they're at a stage of crisis. Crisis being not just the moment someone can be at risk of taking their own life, that is crisis. But oftentimes the first stage of crisis for people with mental health challenges is the moment they can't conceal their experiences from others, whether it's friends, family, loved ones, business associates, academic spaces. When they can't hide their mental health challenges anymore, that becomes a place when they can feel their life start to unravel. Their challenges begin to dominate and create severe problems for them to function and interact. We at the network focus on proactive prevention because of the way that we're able to create an education experience where we want individuals to learn early signs and symptoms and be able to trust in themselves and embrace the ability and agency to go and reach out for supports in a timely manner. With raising the visibility, what we wanted to focus on are the different intersections in which bias can disrupt changing the rates of harm. And we spend a lot of time educating on the individual. And that's where a lot of stigma and concealment works, is the individual staying silent. But we also need to talk about our community spaces and institutions, because if we can work on getting someone empowered to reach out for support, to recognize early signs and symptoms, we still need to ensure that we've created environments that make them feel safe to reach out for support, and that we've created education that empowers institutions to be as supportive as possible. And in order to do that, we need to confront certain things that have perpetuated as bias and stigmas that have compelled people to stay silent. So, as we mentioned before, Raising the Visibility in Season 1, we, in our first episode, talked about body image. And last week, we had a fantastic discussion talking about age. And this week, we're talking sexual orientation. We're, excuse me, next week, we're going to be doing a particular episode dedicated to mental health and violence that we just added earlier this week as a response to talking about things like mass shootings and things I mentioned at the top of the episode. On June 9th, we're going to be talking about gender identity and how there's bias in our institutions and stigmas. Episode 5, we're going to be talking about ethnicity and the intersections there that can impact getting appropriate supports. And then we're going to be closing out Season 1 talking about the economics of mental health and how there's different ways in which the economic realities can impact how we get resources and get validated for mental challenges. Excuse me, I've been talking nonstop, and in our work, we have to do a lot of communication, so my voice is fading pretty badly right now. So episode 3, we're talking sexual orientation, and we want to sort of be crystal clear about what we mean by that. Sexual orientation, for those who don't know, and we never want to insult anyone's intelligence, we're coming from different intersections and understanding. So some of this might seem pretty rudimentary to some of our audience. For others, this could be a whole new discussion they haven't necessarily taken the time to have, and we want to help empower that. Sexual orientation, we're talking about loosely, the definition will be something around the presence of a romantic or sexual attraction to other person or persons. It doesn't have to be one person. And I want to use the terms romantic and sexual attraction loosely. Maybe the bigger word, the most appropriate word, just focus on an attraction. You are you in anything inside of your corporeal self, and what draws you to someone else. And there can be different sort of motivations for doing that. And the end result can be different sorts of things. It could be a physical encounter. It could be an entirely platonic being with someone, just sort of sharing physical space with someone. So we don't want to put any presumptions on what sexual orientation means in terms of, it doesn't just mean the person you want to have sex with, okay? There's a wide spectrum to that. All you need to sort of be focused on is that sexual orientation is about basically what our innate sense of attraction is to other person or persons. It could be multiple. And it behooves me to also mention here that, does that mean we're going to talk about gender? Oftentimes, you're going to see when you talk about sexual orientation that, you know, in a presentation at a panel or a symposium, it'll be identity and orientation, and it's innate to want to talk about those things together. Number one, if you're not someone who lives inside of these experiences on a day-to-day basis, you're not someone who academically, professionally, or just as a reality of your life lives with navigating identity and orientation, which we're going to talk about why that could happen, then it can be really easy to conflate that talking about sexual orientation and talking about gender identity are one and the same. There are lots of intersections in which you cannot escape that you have to acknowledge certain things, but we want to, these are very large discussions, and we think it's the most appropriate way to try to hold space for each avenue. We're going to mention things about gender identity today, but in order to give it its full appreciation, we have an entire episode focused on gender identity, which is episode 4. So again, you see that little sort of Rubik's Cube. That's kind of the reality of it. It's a sort of shifting, orbiting reality that has intersections together. But we're going to be focusing on orientation more so than gender identity. And we don't want someone dropping in the middle of the episode and be like, wait, so you're excluding it? It's not an exclusion. This is just how we can give the maximum amount of respect to each avenue as it intersects. So coming into this, orientation is a spectrum also. Just getting, again, we're coming from different spaces. And so some people, this is going to be like, well, of course, duh. But for others, you may think of sexual orientation and you may just think of the term heterosexual and homosexual. And maybe you would even think of bisexual. And then to be perfectly frank, you might even think of transsexual. Transsexual is talking about gender identity, just as a word to the wise. And remember, always learning experiences. So that's just an example of the way you could get these things confused if you're not necessarily spending a lot of time trying to learn or haven't had to navigate these things before. So I don't want you to necessarily fixate too much on this graphic. We pulled from medium.com. I was actually thinking of a way to sort of demonstrate sexual orientation as a spectrum. And to be perfectly frank, there's almost no way that you could put it that if you're an expert or someone deeply, passionately engaged in these discussions, you might find the image problematic because there can be exclusion, there can be creating images that it feels like there's a hierarchy to them, which is all part of the baggage of trying to navigate talking about sexual orientation because there's been a lot of bias and prejudices and things put into this space. So that's trying to show the maximum amount of respect, but we're not going to be apprehensive and not talk about these things. I picked this graphic because it's not hierarchical. The colors aren't even supposed to be like, if you fit here, you're in this color and this color. This isn't necessarily associated with, if you think of, for people who are not necessarily familiar with these conversations, this isn't even something where you want to think of this as those images represent the pride flag, which, again, if you are more experienced with these conversations, you might be like, well, of course not, Carl. But again, I had to be really careful in thinking about how we're going to navigate this because there's going to be different places we're coming from on these topics. And it's important to understand that when we talk about sexual orientation, because of the way bias works, because of the way prejudices work, one of the things it does is it limits and tries to control what we have as understanding and what we have as knowledge on a topic. And when you talk about sexual orientation, limiting the topic to it just means you're gay or straight is ignoring the vast reality of a lot of people's different innate experiences. So the whole point of this graphic isn't that you need to take it as a sort of the gospel truth of this is how you read and understand orientation. This is to make you understand that there is a wide spectrum. This isn't about there's an A and a B and maybe a C. There's a wide spectrum of things that have to go into this. And we need to talk about why this matters. And we're going to come back into the spectrum part. But when we talk about sexual orientation, there's a few stats I think are important to talk about leading into talking about bias. Pulling these stats, I paraphrase data from the great homies at the Trevor Project. When it comes to mental health and suicide prevention, LGBTQ youth are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. And when we say peers, this is based on surveying in which individuals are reporting or communicating suicide attempts. So it's not just a wild guess, a roll of the dice. And these are people who are identifying within the spectrum. And I want you to take a note here. And again, this might be minutia for some people, but when you see the thing LGBTQ, you will note in there L, lesbian, G, gay, B, bisexual, T, transsexual, Q, queer, and there's others. LGBTQ, there's IA, there's other letters, IA, there can be plus. Those letterings, there's not a set in stone organization to those letterings. So again, I want you to understand that this isn't to be thought of as some sort of simplified thing. And why we want to focus on you understanding that is that people have worked very hard to embrace and own their identities and their self-expression and realizing their true selves in the face of a lot of prejudice and resistance. So when you get to things like LGBTQ, there's a whole drop-down menu of discussions and dialogue about what's included in that, what's not. I bring that up right this moment because you would notice we're talking about sexual orientation, which is primarily talking about, the letters L, G, B, and Q in there. But we're not excluding T because, again, intersection. But we also don't want to disrespect that transsexual is talking inside of gender identity and shouldn't be ignored or assumed it's the same thing as being bisexual, lesbian, or gay, because that's disrespecting the nuances of these conversations. So again, you may be coming from a space where you're saying, that's, of course, Carl, that's kindergarten stuff. But for some of you, that may have never occurred to you, and I just want you to understand that it's always best for us to listen and appreciate these things and not set in your head that there's things that are set in stone. Other stats that we know are, just as a sort of getting a sampling of what we're talking about here, according to the Trevor Project, nearly an estimated 1.8 million LGBTQ youth between the ages of 13 and 24 have seriously considered suicide each year in the U.S., again, based on surveying. And those rates of suicidal ideation outpace individuals who have been surveyed who do not identify within the spectrum of LGBTQ plus and beyond, okay? So we're noticing a disproportionate rate of thought and self-harm risk. That's one of the things we need you to understand here. In comparison to people who do not self-identify within the LGBTQ spectrum, we see that there's at least, again, through surveying, at least one attempt of suicide nearly every 45 seconds. That's a projection. That's a higher rate than people who are not self-identifying within these orientation spectrums. And research is starting to show us that when it comes to mental health services and support, when you identify within the LGBTQ spectrum and beyond, you are met with a number of disparities in services that have links to a lack of understanding, a lack of information, a lack of appreciation for the nuances of your lived experience. And these are direct obstacles to someone being able to reach out and get life-saving support, clinical treatments across a wide range of different mental health challenges, whether it's something that's a matter of diagnosable illness or an experience with trauma or psychological injury. And we're going to talk even more about that data when we bring in our guest expert. But I want to bring us to the next thing, because like I said, raising the visibility, the goal is talking about the institutional and community side of how we can combat and support and get things proactive. And when you talk about bias, when it comes to sexual orientation, I want to use a word that can encompass a wide range of problems. Remember, at the institutional level, someone who walks around and is negative or aggressively malevolent to LGBTQ plus individuals, they might be homophobic, and we'll talk about that term in a second. But when you think of an institution, people inside of an institution, whether it's a school, a clinical practice, a company, a governing body, I want you to think about the term heterosexism, which is nothing fancier than the belief that heterosexual, and again, we're going to talk about gender for a second here, male and female is the default setting of relationships. It is normal. That's what normal is. And anything that isn't heterosexual isn't normal. Even if, and it's important to understand this, That doesn't mean we're saying you're a foaming mouth bigot who's saying, I don't want these types of people around and they're evil and they're terrible and we have to protect our kids from them. We're going to talk about what that looks like. But heterosexism is something that a lot of people can subconsciously, meaning you're not even aware of it, you can subconsciously possess a heterosexist attitude, which is to assume that the default, the normal, every person you look at is heterosexual unless they identify otherwise. For instance, a good example of a way of looking at heterosexism is if someone starts, let's say you're a teacher in a classroom, okay, of third graders. This is a space where there's a lot of legislation, and we're going to talk about it. There's government activities trying to regulate what you can and cannot talk about to younger students, okay? And some of that is based on you can't be bringing up LGBTQ plus spectrum topics. But if you don't see any problem with a teacher in that classroom talking about their husband or wife, and that person is themselves the opposite sex, so a female talking about her male husband, a man talking about his female wife, okay, if you don't see anything controversial or weird about that, and there isn't anything weird about it, but think about the way people might find it controversial to talk about a gay couple, that is you growing up and maintaining a belief that the default, the norm, the issue that doesn't even matter, it's not of any sort of discussion, is heterosexual. It's the default. So I want you to think about that for yourselves. You may be in a state of mind, you yourself may be homosexual, bi, pan, anything in the orientation spectrum other than heterosexual, and even you might look at your orientation as an other, as something that deviates from heterosexuality, that heterosexuality is the core basis of everything, and anything that isn't that is a deviation. That's heterosexism. That can create and does create bias, blind sides, failures to consider and validate people's experiences. It's very important to understand this. This is different from homophobia, transphobia, and things like that, okay? We'll talk about that in a second. But heterosexism is something that there's a very high likeliness that if you identify as heterosexual, okay, and you grew up without ever necessarily questioning, thinking, wondering about anything but the person that is the opposite of the gender you identify as, you very well could have adopted and embraced heterosexist attitudes. That doesn't make you evil, doesn't make you bad, doesn't make you wrong. It's just a reality of the way our society is structured, and I just want you to think about that. So heterosexism isn't about, oh, you're evil and bad and for shame, for shame, for shame. It's just understanding your perspective, right? Because there are things such as homophobia, okay? Homophobia is an active prejudice, okay? Homophobia is not only do you think that someone who is not heterosexual is not normal, you think it's actively wrong. You might think it's evil. You might use any sort of words to describe it as negative or malevolent. And you may even want to actively work against that reality being in your space or your community. And when we talk about homophobia, that's not the only term for these kind of prejudices. Typically, homophobia in a dictionary would be talking about someone who has a prejudice against an individual who's lesbian or gay. But people extend homophobic attitudes towards individuals who recognize themselves to be bisexual, pansexual, asexual. Homophobia tends to just ignorantly cross-blanket anyone who deviates from heterosexuality. Now, that's also where a thing like transphobia comes into play, because remember, we're separating the two conversations only in holding space for them. But oftentimes, transphobia, which is the committed view of creating prejudice against individuals who are transitioning inside of the trans spectrum, anywhere inside of the gender identity part of this conversation. And that's where transphobia can come into play. But someone who's homophobic could tell you that they think it's all the same stuff, okay? And when we'll talk about in episode 4, someone may be transphobic, but would sit down, look you in the eye and say, I am not homophobic at all. Absolutely not. And we'll talk about that more in episode 4. But I just wanted to bring this up so that you can appreciate there's a difference between heterosexism, the assumption that normal is heterosexuality, and homophobia, which is like an active prejudice and bigotry. Because if you're not someone who's actively being a bigot towards someone who's LGBTQ+, you may say, well, I'm not problematic. I'm not part of anything that needs to change or improve or enhance in terms of being able to support these people because I'm not some homophobe. But being heterosexist can create attitudes that can be obstacles for people too. And we see this in real time. At the very top of this episode, I talked about we had a massive school shooting. And it's the 30th plus school shooting we've had since the year began. It's above 200. I think we're near something like 220 plus mass shootings we've had. And next week, we're going to be talking right on the money about public violence in America and mental health, because there is a conversation that we get to have there. But I want to also point out to you, doing things to reject, dehumanize, constrain, alienate, or completely marginalize individuals because of their orientation or their gender identity is also a form of violence. And America has a violence problem. And we currently see a very violent set of legislation being done in the name of protecting children, families, protecting the sense of the sanctity of the home by restricting, constraining, and banning the dialogue and acknowledgement of the existence of sexual orientations beyond heterosexuality. And next week, we're going to dive in more about how the spectrum of violence works. But I want you to understand that violence with a gun, taking a tool and shooting high-velocity metal projectiles into other individuals and eviscerating their flesh and organs and killing them is violence. But the rejection of people's humanity through policies and practices is also a form of violence. In the same way that hindering safety to secure shelter and sustenance are forms of violence. In the same way that creating policies or being indifferent to policies that create severe inequality and disrupt access to medical, to healthcare are forms of violence. And you may sit there and be like, well, that's not violence, you're stretching terms. We're going to talk more about that next week, but this isn't the debate part. That's a point of fact. Because these laws, for instance, that are being passed, some being colloquially called the Don't Say Gay bills, even though they come in the words of the Family Rights Bill of Rights or the Parents' Bill of Rights and things, denying someone's existence and their humanity, creating environments where you're saying that it's not okay to talk about these things, can perpetuate homophobia in people. It can perpetuate mindsets in households, school buildings, companies, medical facilities, all the places that we're trying to create resources to help people's mental health. You can create environments that are hostile to these individuals or feel hostile to these individuals and can perpetuate silence, stigma, shame, which only increases the silence and concealment factor. And it is the concealment in which mental health challenges escalate. And that escalation is the highest risk factors for mental health crisis, self-harm, and suicide. That's a fact. So doing things like these bills is not an abstract concept. It's not, think of the slippery slope. This is a one-to-one action that can induce and increase harm. That's the point. So talking right now, even though I brought up school shootings to start here, talking right now about how we can combat prejudice and be aware of biases in our institutions is a direct way of resisting things that can ultimately harm our peers, our friends, our community members. And there is a one-to-one correlation there. And if you think that's jumping the rails, again, we'll talk about this more next week, but I'm just stating as a fact, this isn't up for debate, that we're not the only country that has prejudices and biases against people based on their orientation and gender, among other things. But what other people in other nations are doing is no excuse or validation for what we aren't or should be doing. So we're going to jump into this conversation because it's important. And if you're coming from a place where you live these realities around navigating orientation every day, thank you for joining us. If you're new to these conversations, we hope you will continue to listen and stay engaged. Because we're going to bring on, we've got a fantastic panel of advocates and people who are passionate about this. But we're going to first bring on our guest expert, Sean Connolly, to talk a little bit of brass and tacks here. So without further ado, let's bring on our first guest, Sean.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Hey, Sean, it's so good to have you here. Thank you for joining us on Raising the Visibility. As always, Sean, let us start with a little bio background. Why don't you let the good people know who you are, where you coming from?
Yeah, so Sean Connolly, I'm here with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'm the LGBTQ coordinator for the state chapter here in Illinois, which means we support a lot of grassroots efforts to both educate, push priorities in Springfield, and just try to build capacity to improve suicide prevention and educate around suicide risk for the whole state population, but I'm specifically focused on groups that are working with LGBTQ. A lot of intersections in this work. And so I used to be on the board, was the treasurer for a while, had to step down as I got kind of tied up where I'm coming from with this big H is I'm a educator with Helix Education. We work with K-12 populations. We work in project-based learning, and we try to develop social and emotional learning and transferable skills more than anything. And I'm also an adjunct at Loyola University. So I've been in education for the last 10 years, and I've been with AFSP for about 6 or 7. Been gay, I guess, for 32. So at 32. So I'm very excited to have this conversation tonight.
Well, thank you again for joining. And, from your experience, and of course, we always want to let people know that whenever we have guests on, even with our panel, we're not expecting people to speak for the whole of a community, the whole of a thing. We're talking from your perspectives and your perch in the world and the universe. Sean, so I think one of the things I kind of want to jump in right away is because of the very prescient reality about legislation that's out there actively trying to repress discussions and acknowledgement of the existence of orientation for millions, potentially millions of youth, hundreds of thousands of millions of youth. What is it that, from your experience, what is it from a sort of, as the advocate and policy leader in Illinois, what are things that, if you're an educator, a parent, someone like that, how do you have a discussion just about what people are doing with this legislation? How do you ensure that you're making sure your kids, the people that you're around, don't feel necessarily traumatized, or at least how can they deal with the potential trauma if they are questioning or identifying? And 2, building advocacy and peers and allies. We can't just say this conversation only has to be had for people who already recognize orientation. So kind of what are some things that we can think about here?
Yeah, I mean, these policies are alarming. been the norm now for some time. I mean, we were equally concerned over, the quote unquote bathroom bills in several states a few years ago. It's just the current iteration of these things. And I think it's really important that regardless of if it's in formal education settings, in informal family settings, informal social settings, wherever you can, supporting LGBTQ young people and youth just by listening, by supporting their ideas, by hearing them out that they might exist on the spectrum somewhere, right? We all do. Supporting that things change rapidly in adolescence and in just life generally. And so just constantly, reinforcing that you're there, you've got their back. I think creating peer networks, following some of what Gleason, Trevor Project, AFSP, there's a number of artists out there who are trying to set up groups, but it doesn't always have to be that in the classroom. I mean, that would be ideal, right? Inclusive curricula is top, but since that's a bridge too far in some states right now, don't feel like that takes away your power to still help LGBTQ people in your life. You can absolutely have those in one-on-one conversations, creating peer networks in your town, in your communities, in your neighborhoods, on your block, wherever it is that you can provide that sense of it's okay. You're just as good as anybody else. I really appreciated the conversation you were having about heterosexism and how often that comes up in the world. It's not something that when I was growing up, I'm 32, we didn't really have a full understanding of that. And you're right. It's like, that's not really homophobia, right? Like the fact that every single love song is a hetero love song affects me though, right? I'm getting married to my partner next year. Super excited about that, but it's tricky to find certain types of songs. And it's like, I don't think everybody's homophobic that made this music, but it's a challenge. And so I think it's just remembering that, continue to break those things down. And I mean, here in Chicago, we have a wealth of amazing bookstores where you can buy super great LGBTQ friendly books for all ages, things like that. And I just would really encourage you to not be discouraged by some of the systemic issues at the state houses where things are really getting ugly and our population is being politicized and sort of used as a target just for cheap points, and instead really focus on building those human connections and just supporting your loved ones, people you care about, in the same way you support them if they had any sort of other thing going on in their life, and just be there and be your authentic self with them.
And thank you. That's perfect. Very insightful. And on top of that, coming back to sort of the heterosexism thing, let's drill in a little bit here. How could, let's say we're going to go through the different parts of like the institutions and community. Let's say you're a mental health professional. What does having a heterosexist sort of baseline viewpoint, what could that do in terms of engaging potentially youth, that you could be supporting? What's the blind sides that could come up? What could that look like?
Yeah, I think it's, you can accidentally make comments that might reinforce the walls of the closet. Let's put it that way, maybe. Not meaning to, but you might easily accidentally do something like that by saying, like, don't worry, the right girl will come around for you, young person who's a male, or something like that. Well, you're not trying to be malicious. You're not necessarily being homophobic at all. But you might accidentally have that blind spot that makes it harder for that person to come out, to start realizing that they can validate those feelings that they're having, and to start explore them, really, really talk it through with trusted people, goes about it in their own way, and really begin processing the whole thing. So I think those blind spots in a clinical sense, we're doing a lot of work at AFSP with the Trevor Project, Human Rights Campaign, and other groups, trying to figure out how do we improve, emergency care settings when people present? How do we make sure in-school counselors know more of how to address and work with all populations, LGBTQ and S, straight kids too. I mean, everybody across the whole spectrum. I think one cool thing, as somebody who's worked in education my whole life, getting to work with so many young people, we continue to see a more nuanced understanding of sexual orientation with each new generation of students, right? They get it. They understand that it isn't a binary situation. The gayest gay person is not only gay. The straightest straight person is not only straight. We understand that these things are very fluid, and it's just a matter of where you are at any given point in time. So I feel like we're getting some improvement. And I feel like trying to make sure we do the appropriate trainings and build awareness across the country to help counselors, especially people working with young people, but generally anybody, just remembering that like everyone is not straight that you meet. Every person is not also gay, clearly, but you need to make sure you're not reinforcing closet walls, I think is a good way to put it.
And I really love that, reinforcing closet walls. I don't think I'm familiar with that phrase, and now it's going to be glued into the repertoire. I think with that said, one of the things that I want to highlight that you said, at the clinical side of life, whether your school guidance, okay, all the way up to your hospital or private practice, there's always opportunities. You're told in your profession, you go to seminars and things for whether it's all the way as formal as being updated if the DSM-6 or something comes out, all the way down to in schools at that ground level of seeing students every day, youth every day, that there's all sorts of protocols you go through in professional development. It sounds like one of the things that we can really be advocating for is if you work with youth, aside from just knowing the rates of harm for opiate addiction and things like that, which matter, making sure that you at least once a year do like a brush up or an engagement with how am I supportive, how am I best informed on LGBTQ and beyond, seems like an effective strategy.
Oh yeah, it's imperative, right? I mean, it's so important that we make those trainings accessible, that they're easy to access, that they're open to everybody that could potentially want to come in. And we have a lot of experience with like continuing education credits and that language, but even just making them, I think the pandemic and one of its positive outcomes has been, it's okay if it's on Zoom, it's okay if it's on YouTube. It's like, get the language out there, get those resources out there, get the collateral that can help online, as well as much in person as we can do. But making sure people realize how important it is to stay current and how we're still in really the nascent stages of most of this research and work. I mean, I think a lot of stuff has been called into question in the last few years, obviously with the pandemic, but, Obergefell is new law. Gay marriage being not federally banned is new. I'm old enough, and I'm not that old, to still appreciate that right of mine. Younger people don't necessarily get that. I think older people sometimes miss that we haven't necessarily had that whole sea change yet. So constantly updating and staying up to date on our new findings as well, especially because of how much energy there is around researching a number of intersections, but especially suicide prevention and risk factors for LGBTQ folks across the spectrum and across the age spectrum right now, that it is really, really important that your state is up to date as possible. And I think it's imperative for us as the institutional agencies and on the federal side, as long as we have an ally at the federal government level, to ensure that they're making the things as accessible as well.
Oh, that's great. And I think to piggyback on that, I think about, going in the institutions and communities, teachers who, teachers got a lot to worry about these days and all days in the universe. But, the way I would put it is like, from a teacher standpoint, there's the apprehension of like, what are the right words these days? What am I doing? What is it for, because teachers can also be the place, a safety net of you have those relationships all the time, right? And it's not necessarily a teacher's job to be guidance. That may be totally inappropriate for their role, but in the classroom, in the academic spaces, languaging, right? What is it for them that helps to be supportive? How do they stay mindful of making sure that they're reinforcing an inclusive space, even though their job is to teach math or history, and they may not necessarily,
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, right. So when we think of math as an example, right, math may not have a direct correlation to LGBTQ, but perhaps occasionally in your examples, you just ensure that you're in the classroom. If somebody tells you, if you have a student that mentions, hey, I want to go by these pronouns, just respect that, right? It's an easy thing to do. And that can change again, depending on the age of the kid and what's going on. Like, respect that. When it comes to history, I mean, having LGBTQ inclusive curriculum is important, and that is more formal. And learning about Harvey Milk or Marsha P. Johnson or Stonewall would be a super helpful step forward in ensuring that we have a legitimately inclusive school system that is helping people feel more comfortable in their own bodies, in their own orientations, and who they love, et cetera. So there's more formal stuff when we start talking about history, social studies, and things like that are near and present. And Gleason, like I said, has come out with those 4 pillars, and one of them is a major focus on LGBTQ inclusive curriculum. As controversial as that is, I'm from Alabama originally. I recognize how tricky that can be. But I think it's imperative for states like Illinois, especially where we can, to move the ball forward and set the example on what that kind of curriculum looks like and what it means to have an open, inclusive curricula across all spectrum, right? So gender, race, and sexual orientation in this conversation.
Perfect. And I think that's just for folks who are wondering, like, if you can appreciate on the face of it what that means, great. But at the same time, you should also recognize that there's a few things that happen when you do things like have representational education. Okay, the easy one that might be out there is like, well, you shed light on the existence that being gay, bisexual, trans. None of this is an aberration that started yesterday or because of Facebook, which is pushing back against things. But if you're youth in that classroom, there's a term that comes to mind here that I wonder if you'd want to riff on a little bit. Someone talks about being seen, and we kind of talked about inclusion. Does that matter? That's it. Does that matter?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it can matter more. I mean, especially, I mean, every time we go another year, every gay person, every queer person hopes that this is the last time, that this is the final generation that has to go through the processes that a lot of us had to go through. But, if I had seen examples of LGBTQ leaders and the activists that existed in the classroom in my K-12 education, I might have been faster to recognize that rather than the initial reaction to non-straight sexual feelings as, oh no, I'm wrong, something's wrong with me personally, I have an issue. It's just like, oh, I'm just like Harvey Milk. Oh, I'm just like this person. Oh, I'm like this person in history. Being seen cannot be understated as critically important, especially across the country where we have so many rural school districts where you may not actually have a lot of examples. We're fortunate in Chicago to have such a thriving LGBTQ civic life, but in rural Alabama where I grew up, it was less so. So it would have been helpful to see more examples of that and to know that, being gay is not your entire identity unless you want it to be. But there's gay athletes, there's gay presidents, or well, maybe not gay presidents yet, one day, but we're getting there. And I think acknowledging that, being open about it, and teaching it in that context is super important for students. And I think even for adults too, to just remember that we're around here. I think that's why we saw gay marriage move so quickly is, finally people started listening to Harvey Milk thing about come out. And when we all made ourselves known, it was like, oh, well, there's more of you than we thought. Here we all go. And you're not some sort of two-headed monster. We understand you. You're great. And I think that's what we're facing right now. It's coming out of the pandemic is reminding people that we are just as many of your neighbors, of your civic leaders, of your teachers, of your friends, of your pharmacists, of your doctors, of whatever, as are your straight peers. And please stop passing legislation that is attacking us for different reasons.
And with that, I think this is another place where I bring up again, it's too easy. You escape the conversation. People can escape or excuse themselves from these conversations if you just focus on the concepts of homophobia and the very visible malevolence. Going back to heterosexism, again, I want to talk about the thing about representation, which we're on. At the top of the episode, I talked about there's just inescapable intersectionalities here. And you brought up Marsha P. Johnson, and I think another thing to talk about here is that the LGBTQ conversation is not a linear conversation either. That for those who don't know, you should Google if you're not familiar with someone like Harvey Milk. But why I bring up those two individuals is that there's also different nuances that education can help you bring in, because there are community aspects that navigating sexual orientation also have to confront with. So, being visibly Caucasian and from ethnic, Eurocentric background versus growing up across the African and Black diaspora, growing up in any other sort of cultural, ethnic background, religious intersections can be a part of it. So this is kind of talking about people who already want to be in the game, expanding awareness and getting advocacy going. Expanding, what are good strategies for making sure that we're not just having one sort of like myopic conversation?
Yeah. I think to add some context too, I mean, I think there was a period of time briefly where when we saw a rainbow flag, we assumed, well, racism must not exist there as well, right? We can't possibly have sexists because they're under the rainbow flag, right? They're LGBTQ. I think we finally in our community are beginning to address those things. It's a slow and steady conversation here in the state of Illinois, and I'm sure elsewhere in the country, but we're getting there. And I feel like it's also important to not just define people by one thing. It's like, I might be gay. That doesn't necessarily change my opinion here, 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 my identity here, here, my heritage here, here, and here. And I think this is where we really start dealing with the systemic reforms and changes that we are striving for, and what it's really going to take to create a fully inclusive environment. It's not worth anything if we have a LGBTQ friendly school that teaches white supremacist based curriculum or racist curriculum or sexist curriculum. We have to address all of these things head on. It is a big fight. It's a huge undertaking. This stuff wasn't built overnight either, that we're trying to reform, break down in some cases, reconsider entire approaches to. And I think it's important that we realize when we win victories for any of the acronym in the queer spectrum, that we also show up when our allies who helped us get there are in need, and we understand we're all part of that same thing. We all have our own sincere self that needs the support. We all have an occasional time where we're the othered, and it's important that we show up for one another in those times of stress, and we continue to build to a truly equitable world in which everybody feels comfortable. So, Carl, I don't know if that answers that, but was my reaction to what you're saying.
No, and that's perfect. I mean, some people could think it's messy, but being complicated doesn't have to, and messy is fine too, but like being complicated, that's fine. It doesn't have to all fit into like a neat little like box. And that's, you perfectly touched on it. There's so many different parts of this that it's dangerous. I just think, and I'm glad you brought the pride flag for us, just because that helps illustrate that like it's more complicated than thinking that anybody for any reason they want can come out of a closet, or that, even just talking regionally because of our social and cultural realities, where you grew up because of intersections with faith as much as economics or ethnicity can determine whether this is even going to be a situation you're going to deal with when you're 12, 14, 25, 30. And I just, the last part about this before we go to our panel that I kind of wanted to talk about with you is the journey of, we're done trying to justify people's existence. We're not saying it's okay to be gay. I mean, it is okay to be gay, but like, we're not waiting for anyone to accept, that existence. Like, it is here, and but for people who find themselves silenced and challenged and struggle because of any number or one of these facets or a number of them, they just feel alone and hopeless because of what they see out in the world. What are things that, yes, have hope, let's fight, let's kick ass, or what are tools that, even because of the internet or whatnot, that they could help to empower themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think finding those networks of support, finding peer networks online has changed the game quite a bit. I think, as we continue to see this polarization move forward in the United States, we're going to continue to see it be harder, I think, for LGBTQ, for queer kids across the country that are just born into more to less queer friendly states, I guess is a way to put it. And I don't think that's going to get better. It's been that way with other things, right? There's a big difference between being born in a Polish society right now than maybe 20 years ago if you're gay. And I think there's going to continue to be challenges there. And I think the internet can help you find some of those support systems that you might need. I think this show is important. Finding networks on Twitch, finding networks wherever you can, to just hear like-minded, or not even like-minded, just similar people who are maybe going through some sort of struggle. But I think it's also important that they find somebody they can trust, whether or not that's in person or online. Find somebody you can talk to. Find somebody that you can really trust, and begin going from that, and realize that you have done nothing wrong. You are not wrong in any potential way. You are a beautiful person, just like every other human in this world. And it is really, really important that one day you will find the love that you're seeking. We're all out here. We're all together. And people don't not accept you because of anything. It's their ignorance usually that is driving that behavior as well. And we'll get to them as well. So just bear in mind that love will get to you at some point if you can just hang in there. Finding the network online until you're ready to look for it in person. If you need in person, finding it online and that sustains you is totally fine as well. But it's just imperative that people realize they are not alone, and that in an interconnected world that has a lot of challenges in an internet environment, one of the positives of that can be finding like-minded folks who support you, regardless of if they're also gay, right? It doesn't just mean finding a gay person. It just means finding somebody who loves and respects and supports your authentic self. I think I would have loved that. And I had a lot of support, luckily, in person, but there was no internet back in the day in rural Alabama. So I think that really leveraging those tools. And if you're an adult, or if you're somebody who just knows somebody who's struggling, encouraging that same behavior. And if you're ever worried about somebody, not being afraid to pick up the phone, contact Trevor, contact the SAGE hotline. Soon, Carl, just to make this pitch, which I'm sure has happened before, but 988 will be the suicide prevention hotline. We're getting there. You can be connected to somebody in your peer group, but just making sure not to be afraid to reach out to support for yourself, somebody you care about, and just realize that it's a journey, but it will get there. Love will break through.
That's the powerful stuff, and we're gonna move into our panel in a second, but I'm also behooved to say, there's the person who may be feeling alone and they need support and navigation. What about the persons who, they've got "we're not gonna take it" going through their head, and they want to get activists, whether it's in their school, their town, their household. You got any pointers or thoughts about that?
I mean, I think it's imperative right now, and a couple of fire trucks are going past me right now, so there's going to be a little siren. But I think it's very, very important. I mean, pay attention to your state houses. Pay attention to what's going on in your state capital, right? Here in Springfield, we've been really lucky, but we passed a conversion therapy ban that AFSP was supporting in Springfield not that long ago. It might surprise, I think it was 4 years ago now, maybe That's 4.5. Yeah. So there's always work to do. We are always just one election away from rollbacks, as it were. Get active, hold your corporations, your small businesses, your local nonprofits accountable, hold your peer networks accountable. Do not let people make homophobic comments, even if no one who is openly gay, bisexual, or lesbian or queer is near you. Cut that conversation at the root. Do not allow for it. Call it out when you need to. If you are comfortable, if you're willing to be that advocate and you have that type of personality, just do it. We will collectively thank you all over the world for being the person who calls it out at every single level. And even if it's just your parents, your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your old friend from high school, do not let that insidious homophobic language become a part of your day-to-day life, because it will eventually meet somebody like us who will be on the receiving end of it, and it's hard. So I would just really encourage you to just take a hardcore stance on it and just get out there and don't be afraid to be that guy or that person who says something to somebody who makes a ignorant homophobic statement in passing. And I would say right now, especially, I know next session that I'm on, we're talking about gender orientation, but we're seeing just examples after examples of national figures making transphobic statements constantly. And it's under the guise of, like, I'm just saying, and you really gotta call that stuff out.
I'm just saying, yeah.
And I don't want to go too far into the gender. It's outrageous. And so, get in there, and there's spaces to do it without having to go to your state capital too.
Yeah, that's perfect. And we're going to talk. I think that's a place where we're going to carry over into activism, because again, I think a lot of these conversations, the status quo has been a passive one. Like, how do we survive and move and dip that job? But I think, again, we've been, and generations have been, across a whole spectrum of marginalized people, of people who have been discounted in America and the universe of humanity. But being passive isn't the way to be anymore. I mean, you need to be passive. It's cool, but we're going to talk about activism and living our best life. We're going to take a little transition to bring our panel on. We've got, I think, a word from our network buddies, and then we're going to bring our panel on. So, Sean, thank you so much. We'll see you on the flip side of a little visit from our network pals.
Hey, Jester, what does stigmas mean?
You never heard of stigmas?
Nope.
You ever feel like you can't talk about how you're feeling?
Yeah, sometimes I don't feel good, but I don't want to say something because I feel silly.
You're not alone, Blooper. Many people feel like they're supposed to hide their feelings. Some can feel silly, even ashamed. It's like their own fault for feeling bad.
When I feel down, I don't want to talk because everyone around me seems fine. I don't want to bring them down.
Things that make us feel bad to talk about our mental health are stigmas.
Oh, I get it. But who made stigmas, sister? Like, where do they come from?
Stigmas try to control how we express ourselves. And when it comes to mental health, stigmas are false beliefs about how mental health works.
But Jester, who makes stigmas? When did I catch them?
Stigmas don't come from one person or place. We all have inherited stigmas through social and cultural factors.
Social and cultural factors?
We all catch stigmas by false beliefs about mental health being repeated by friends, family, and in pop culture like TV.
How do I stop from catching stigmas, Jester?
It's not someone's fault for being influenced by stigmas, but we resist stigmas by understanding that our mental health is a natural part of life. And having a mental health challenge is just the same way in any other part of our body is unwell.
You mean like if I catch a cold or get hurt falling off my bike?
Exactly. There are many things we can do to take care of ourselves. And there are professionals who can help us with mental health challenges. In fact, the Whole Person Network's mission is to help folks like you and I learn the early signs of mental health challenges, and so we can do something about it before it leads to harm or complications in our lives.
Early signs?
Remember, Blooper, how stigmas make us silent?
Yep.
It's common for people to hide their mental health challenges until it feels like it's too much and they reach a point of crisis.
Well, if so many of us are impacted by stigmas, that makes us hide our mental health. It's almost like there's a culture of concealment.
Yes, Blooper. You could say when it comes to mental health, we all live in concealment culture.
So, the network wants to help people address their mental health before they get to the crisis?
Exactly, Blooper. Proactive prevention is all about disrupting mental health challenges from escalating.
Oh, awesome! How can I join?
You can become proactive by connecting with the Hope For Us Network.
I really want to make a difference.
Together we can. Come on, I'll help you.
That was the wonderful Network Buddies brought to you by Paul Hay. And we're going to be jumping into our panel to continue this discussion on proactive prevention, talking about orientation today. You just saw our guest expert, Sean Connolly of Helix Education and LGBTQ coordinator for FSP Illinois chapter. Let's bring Sean back. Long time no see, Sean.
That was a fun conversation. I really appreciated this. This is wonderful, Carl.
So glad you're here. And then we're going to bring on our fantabulous panel today. Let's start. Jess, can we see you? Can we hear you?
I don't know. Can you?
Yes, we can now. I can.
Yeah.
Hello, good to see you. Next, we're going to have Kate. Kate.
Hey.
Oh, Kate, thank you for joining us.
That way.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Then we're going to see if we can have Jianna. Jianna, are you there?
Hi, friends.
Yo. And Marlo. I think I hear you.
It sounds
Is that
like
your mic,
Robot
Marlo?
Brillo.
Yes.
It sounds like you're calling. Sounds like you're calling from the Enterprise.
Oh, God.
That
Sounded
was
like
awesome.
a robot. I'm sorry. That was amazing.
I hope that gets clipped because that sounded like a sleepwalking robot. Like, let me see if I need a fan to do it properly.
It was the robot and the slow-mo that was just like
Oh, that was magical.
that was amazing.
How are we doing now, Marlo?
I don't know. my headphones again. Let's see if they work. I also, so I'm just like, what is my robot?
I don't know why this is so funny to me. I'm sorry.
This is, you know what's amazing about this is why is it so slow? I understand the
That's what
robot.
I don't get.
It sounds like the robot's drunk. Oh man.
Oh no, you caught me. Wait, does it still a headphone?
Oh my god.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you what, we're gonna do this. This is just gonna happen. We're gonna go with it. We're gonna try and see. I will respect you on a delay, and let's just see how this works. I'm so sorry to our producer, Scott. But let's rock and roll. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Hi.
Some of you have been expert veterans on the series. And if people ever binge watch these, they're going to be, oh, yeah, I know some of you. But let's do a little quick roundtable just to warm up. And why don't you share first names, last names, who you is, and what brings you to the show tonight? Why did you want to be a part of this panel? Starting with, you're going to go last, Marlo. Jianna, let's start with you.
All right. Hello. I'm Jianna. I am cisgender. I use she, her. I am interested in being in this panel because coming from the way that I was raised and grown up and the way I identify, 2 years ago, I had no idea. And even with a master's, like, I was never taught, I was never exposed. I had to go looking to be able to individualize my treatment planning and able to open my own mind to be able to meet specific needs rather than go by my lack of understanding and my lack of awareness, and just that entire piece of, what's the word I'm looking for? Ignorance. Like, I didn't know. So I did my own research. I did my own work. I did my own surveys. And now I feel like I feel like my role in the community is different than it would have been. And I think it's also important to share that even in higher education, like, it's not prioritized. So we need to make that personal incentive to do that. And that's why I felt empowered and impacted to be here, to just express my own lack of intelligence in the area and how difficult it really is if you're not looking for it.
And thank you. Being an ally, the first step to being an effective ally is recognizing where you are and being willing to listen and not just steamroll into the conversation. So thank you. Kate, welcome.
Thank you. So I am an artist in Chicago. I have a show called One Woman Hamlet, Shakespeare, the Stigma on Mental Illness, that takes Shakespeare, puppets, and music, and it parallels my journey with depression and anxiety with that of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And I am queer, and I grew up and identify as pansexual, but I grew up in a really conservative town in Ohio. I was homeschooled, super isolated. I had no idea what was going on and felt very lonely. And it was a major factor in my coming close to suicide twice, and also to a conservative university. So I didn't really feel like I had community because I'm a similar age to Sean, and there was no internet, right? Like there was no saving you. So I didn't really have community until I was like 25 and living in Chicago. And I agree that the network is community, and this is what I wish I would have had as a kid. So super passionate about perpetuating narratives and community, so that even if you are living in a state where you feel alone, you're not alone. And that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Kate, for joining us. Jess, what's up?
Hi, you can hear me still, right? I don't think I'm muted. I'm Jess. I'm a sci-fi fantasy writer and content creator, and I identify as asexual. So Carl, actually, you came to me and you brought up the panel, and I kind of went through it, and I thought it would be kind of cool to have some, ace representation on the sexuality night. I thought it would be pretty cool because that's a big thing. We don't have a lot of representation, and a lot of people have been talking about that recently, at least on my social media. I've been seeing it a lot. So I thought it would be cool to come in, kind of give my perspective a little bit, since it obviously isn't going to be the same as other people's, but I think it could be interesting. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you, Jess. Rock on, rock on. All right. C3PO, you're up.
Yeah, I connected it to my phone. Is it working?
Yeah, you
did. Oh my god, this is so sad.
I was ready to mute myself because I was like, I'm gonna laugh.
Okay, I can switch to the crappier internet in a minute, so we can all laugh. Okay. But first, I'm just gonna say who I am. I would like to not be laughed at when I say my name. No, I'm joking. So I'm Marlo. The reason I try to bring one of my gayer shirts, just for the occasion, and just queer. So funny, there's two pansexuals here today. I'm also pansexual. I feel like that's not really the most common orientation, so that's kind of interesting and cool. And I'm here also, I feel like the same reason that most of us, just because I grew up with so little access to any information, and I grew up so confused and angry, and on top of that, very, very Christian, so with so much shame and just like, oh my god, I don't think I ever believed I wasn't going to hell until I was like a good 25 years old. Like, and that's a lot to carry. And if there's just people out there now that can access things like this since they're younger, and they can question those things safely instead of like in their room crying because they think they're the worst person ever, like, that's amazing. And if we can be a part of that, that's just a really beautiful thing to be a part of. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So righteous that you be here, and I'm glad we got that mic sorted out. And jumping right into the thick of things, we're starting with activism and things like that. And I want to start the topic on we're in a universe where it's no longer about justifying our existence, as I talked about Sean in isolation. On the activism front here, okay, Jess, you talked about asexual, and we heard this term pansexual, and I think a form of activism is even just sort of making sure there's room inside of the orientation troop, because that had been, there had been a fight for it's just gays, and then there was gays and lesbian, and there's, some people are, there's a fight for, are we putting, and I don't mean brutal fight, but like, let's just sort of talk about representation just in terms of the whole orientation spectrum. And what does that mean to you? And what have you found? Let's just go there. I don't want to put too many, I don't want to put that in too much of a box. Let's just talk right there. I'm going to start with Jess. I'm going to pick on you just a little bit.
No.
Only in the sense that I'm just going to say this frankly, when we talk about a thing like asexual, I hear the same dialogue that used to be okay to talk about bisexual people, like a total erasure. So I don't want to pick on you and tokenize that. Because pansexual, I hear sort of the same kind of like erasage language. I don't know. What does that mean to you all?
I have definitely had my fair share of even my parents sometimes when we talk about, the fact that I'm asexual, they'll be like, are you though? Like, is that really a thing? Like, they do that to me all the time. Not just my parents, but like, a lot of other people that I'll meet, if they don't really understand the term and what it means, they definitely will sit there and be like, that's not real. Like and it makes you kind of get into the mindset. And I did for a long time before I had a word for it, just kind of feel like something was wrong with me. Because when you're asexual, you're not sexually attracted to anybody. And, all of my friends, that was a conversation in high school, going through puberty, all of that. And I was just like, never interested in that. So I thought there was something wrong with me for a really long time until I found a community and I was able to realize like, oh, I'm not the only one who's like that. But there's still people who are out there that don't actually really see it as a sexuality at all because to them they just don't really understand it, I think. And for me it's more of like being able to have like a word to describe what you're feeling. I think that's what was really important to me, to be able to, why I actually like identify as it. And we were talking about the shirt. I have my Ace flag shirt on, actually. I changed. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that people have especially been like, is it real? Is it real? And yeah, that's definitely something that does bother you.
And what's that? I mean, just sort of going into the loop about that. I mean, because again, erasure is a thing that can happen inside of spaces where theoretically we're all supporting, our orientations, that it's not just heterosexual. What is that? Marlo, when you were sort of talking about it, was that something where you found like you needed to come up with your own sort of form of like activism just to be on that conversation?
For like being pansexual in like a place where that's not understood.
Yeah.
Is that
yeah.
okay? So yes, I think that mostly like in the community, there's definitely like it's not the erasure obviously as big as outside of the community. My dad, I try to explain to him so many times. The one time I finally went, Dad, just think I'm bisexual. That's fine. I'm not, this is fine. And, in the community, there's people that are like, well, it's just that pansexual exists to erase bisexual or stuff like that. And like, there's a lot of war in between. I honestly don't understand why we just need to fight things. I think they're just words that, describe different things or where certain things come from differently. But I think it's a very big thing I've encountered is like bisexual people thinking that the existence of pansexual people kind of erases them, when in reality it's like, no, it's two different things. And not different, it's an umbrella, definitely, but it's two different sentiments per se. So
yeah. And I just wanted to, the reason I touched on that is because King Jianna, coming from a place where you said like there was this, and Sean, you talked about this too in your opening, just the lack of visibility of anything in general, right? And so I kind of want to focus right now just to expand the conversation. The fact that it seems the biggest challenge is just the amount of ignorance out there, but nobody wants to play like tour guide to people who are ignorant. We're not talking about like abusive and like homophobic people. We'll come back to like, again, the malevolent side of things, but just about, how do we, I don't necessarily know if I have a question here. It's just more of like living inside of like the we're talking about bias in our communities. And oftentimes it's that unintentional behavior. So I just wanted to, if you felt comfortable sort of talking about, well, let me just put it around the notes. Like Jianna, what was like one of the first things you realized? Like, oh shit, I don't have any clue what I'm talking about.
Honestly, like there's a lot of times because I find myself getting myself into trouble because I genuinely ask because I care and because I want to know about you. So sometimes like I'll ask a question and it's not so in my reasoning for why I'm asking isn't to be offensive or isn't to imply anything. It's literally just because I have no idea. And I found myself like actually really pissing people off. And then later they're like, oh no, Jianna's great. Like she doesn't really mean to be as dumb as she is. And so so I have to get sometimes introduced as like up front, like she's going to ask some questions. They're going to come off kind of weird, but just go with it. And then I've noticed like that's kind of how it goes. But then now that I am slightly more educated, I can introduce it to my boys and my family, and I can say things like you might feel one thing right now, but that doesn't mean it's going to be that way later. Or so what I mean by that is like, you might seem like you have to like this girl right now, but then maybe later you might like somebody different. And I try to put it in a way where they're seeing the person of interest as a person, not as necessarily an identity or an orientation or even how they say it. So when I think of like pansexual and bisexual, I know the difference because I understand the difference, but then I also know that like gender fluid can also fit within those categories. And the way that I look at all of that is, this is how that person is telling me they are. So that's what I need to believe. And that's how I'm kind of forming my mindset as it's like, if you look at it, somebody's telling me that they are feeling great. So they are feeling great. Like, you just got to believe it and don't ask so many questions about it. Just kind of say, okay. And if you need to be a little bit more supportive, then say, hey, how can I support you feeling great? How can I keep you feeling awesome? And I guess that's just how I approach it. If that makes any sense, or if anybody has follow-up questions, please ask.
No, I appreciate that. And I just bring that up because, again, that's a good starting point for people who they don't know where to begin in this kind of a conversation. But Sean, you talked about...
Real quick, just to also say that. So I remember there was one time, there was a gentleman in the grocery store, and I'm calling him a gentleman because he told me he uses he pronouns. And he was wearing nail polish, he had makeup on, and my son was like, hey, like, is that a boy or a girl, kind of? And he's 6, so I'm sorry if I'm being offensive again. But so I just told him, I was like, why don't you just ask him if he wants to be called? And then you can introduce yourself like, hey, I'm Gavin. I go by he. What's your name? And then see what he says. And that's how I said it. But then somebody else who identified as queer told me, she was like, well, why would you even need to know that? Like, why would you even want to ask that? And I was like, well, because I wanted to know him. Like, that was the only reason. So I was told to think about the why. Like, why are you asking these questions? And so it's made me kind of assess how I approach certain things. And Carl, like you said in the very beginning, listen more than I speak.
Yeah. Well, so that perfectly sets up. I was just going to say, because Sean, you talked about orientation is not it's not who you are. Even if you want to, that can be a big part of like your day to day, but that doesn't mean. So I guess the thing I wanted to sort of expand on was just, this conversation isn't just about how what your orientation is. This conversation is also about how you sort of are going in life currently, right? When we talk about the panel side, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to get at. Is just, it's kind of how are you all feeling right now? We got a lot of bills out there. We've got some violence in the universe, and I just kind of wanted folks to sort of just start riffing a little bit on that.
I mean,
Silence.
yeah. So the idea is, I will say, I mean, the goal would be that we can all get to where it's not, it isn't a big deal to be any of these, to identify wherever you are. And I think that's sort of what we're getting towards. I do think it's a challenge right now still with, especially when we talk about younger people and their interactions, so when my partner and I are out, we might have, it's like, whoa, who is this? Or when I work with younger students or something, he's like, do you have a girlfriend or a wife or not? There's still some trickiness there. But I think that the more we normalize everything, the more normal it becomes. And I think that as we continue, we have to realize normalization is not a passive process. So I think for me, I feel a lot of calls to action and just maintaining that serious work on normalizing us and normalizing everything is as fast as we possibly can and as inclusive, as total as we possibly can. This is one of the first panels I've been on with this particular makeup of the LGBTQ spectrum, and it's wonderful. And I think that speaks to some of the progress we've made.
And to that effect, then what I would sort of again really double down on is, Jenny, you talked about like it's a learning curve for each one of you. Where's your mindset on like do you feel comfortable being like, or finding yourself as kind of like the oracle in your environment, or are you kind of the mindset like, look, somebody asks you a question or you're in a situation where you're catching a lot of ignorance, even if it's not directed at you, you just hear a lot of ignorance, your attitude is to just roll your eyes and be like, that's somebody else's problem. What is your kind of, some people like, they want to get in anywhere in every space is going to be a place where like, we're going to do some, you're going to learn today. Whereas other, what is that for each one of you? What does that kind of like mean to you?
So I'm gonna I guess I'll start here. So for me, with people that I am safe with, I've become a lot better at like speaking up, or spaces that I'm at least a little safe in. At work, I've had a couple of like the diversity meetings where one day they were talking about why like using boy and girl is bad, and they went to like, well, because it's infantilizing adults and stuff, but also I was like, yeah, but because you can't just go by one gender if you don't know someone, right? And like that was like one of the moments there was somebody that like kind of like went back and forth with me and about who should address that, or who should like kind of ask those things, like you were saying, like should we go already saying he or she or this and then they have to correct us, or should we already have the openness of being like, hey, what are your pronouns before addressing someone, or using they, before and stuff. But outside from that, I grew up with, like I said, like a very, very Christian mother where like safe space is not a thing when it comes to anything that goes against the Bible. So like the moment you say gay, it's like, oh, a disgrace. The moment you say any of these things, it's just like very, very extreme. So I do also have like many spaces where, mostly very white spaces because I'm not white, where I just don't feel like I can make a comment or like stand up for the thing. And I just kind of like sit there and go like, okay, yeah, this is totally very funny. But outside of, so that's kind of like how I approach it now.
That's perfect. Yeah, and it's really just about the agency. Like, how do you feel? It's your right to navigate that.
Like the safe space people give you. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's beautiful. No, please, cut me off. I do too much talking. Kate, I saw you down your head out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Marlo and I grew up in similar environments. It was incredibly painful. I still am different day to day and situation to situation, because it's definitely been the case where like I'll post something on social media and I get like a very violent message from my guitar teacher from when I was 11, or I currently decided to do some work for a family-run business and received some really I won't go into details for their privacy, but just some really violent feedback. And now I'm like, oh, do I need to find another job? How do I address this? There's no HR. Like it's Ohio. So it's that can be incredibly painful too, especially because it is your family. Like, I think that we often talk about the kinds of families that completely you're separated from them. They've been like, I think there's like a cartoon picture of that, of like, I don't want you in my life anymore. And then like, I think people see just that separation. And then there's the like family that loves you and accepts you. But then there's the family that's like, we love you, we just hate your sexuality. And it's like, well, then you don't love me, do you? Like, it doesn't feel like love. And all that to say is that sometimes I have bandwidth to talk about that with folks, but I know I need to be in a place where I'm not going to be reactionary, because I know that they will be. And that can be quite challenging to navigate without me needing to recover for months.
No, see, yeah, and I'm glad you share that, because these can feel like burdens. I did, being black, right? Being the black navigator, kind of a thing. Sometimes you feel like you're obligated or you're supposed to say something, but inside of the universe of orientation, which that sort of that like people still can think it's okay to have such a volatile backlash, you know, and I think that's a perfect example of it's not just, you know, that's for your own mental health and safety to not engage that conversation. You know, thank you for sharing that. I wonder about that. Does it ever, I mean, it's got to get frustrating though, like sometimes, because, you know, Sean, you talked about there's every generation hopes they're the you know, the last generation. And I just think about conversations that for some of us, you know, it feels like it's an old conversation, right? Like you don't want to keep having it over and over again. But do you ever catch yourselves being surprised when you meet someone and you feel like you're at square one of these kind of dialogues? Like, we don't need to talk about this anymore.
I mean, I'll say what this is making me think about too is, I mean, coming at this from the suicide prevention work, where, so I lost my sister 7 years ago, or I guess 8 years ago, to suicide. And then it became like, anytime somebody had a mental health thing, well, Sean is your Sherpa, because I had this lived experience as a survivor of suicide loss now. And it's like, well, sometimes I might be able to, but I do think it's important that we talk about that prioritization of what is safe, what you can handle, and that it certainly is not the responsibility of any of us to be your queer Sherpas through straight world. And so like, I think that's an important thing. And it just makes me think of that too, where it's like, sometimes I'm more than happy to, but occasionally, like, yeah, if I start at square one with somebody, it's like, well, let's just pass for now. I don't feel like I need to do this. So I totally think that is a level of agency right there, is being able to say, no, I'm not doing that right now.
And I guess more to that, and carrying on to that, just in a more specific way, personally, if each of you, you know, if you ever feel comfortable, a lot of this is based on the idea of bias around institutions, stigmas inside of institutions. Would any of you recall a moment where like you kind of felt unseen or dismissed right at this intersection? Like you didn't expect it to be, but maybe it sort of blindsided you, where you just felt like you just didn't feel supported. You know, and it was kind of a wake-up call. Kate?
There's a lot. I'm trying to pick one, unfortunately.
I guess, yeah, I was thinking about, because you're talking about college, yeah.
With college, yeah. Specifically with college, it's so funny. Not funny, laugh or cry, but I had girlfriends before I knew what it was to have a girlfriend. Like we were like, I think because I was so isolated, I knew that it was bad to be gay. So I think unintentionally I disassociated my actions from the titles that I was hearing. So I had a girlfriend at the time, and then I remember the school made us all go to it was like an anti-queer rally, talking about how like God doesn't want us to be on the spectrum, and we're holding hands. And I just remember feeling like this deep pit of loneliness. And then that next week was when I considered taking my life, but I had no language to describe that was what was going on for me. I still wouldn't have said that I was queer or I was on the spectrum. I didn't know what I was at that point. I was like, oh, my friend, which is, you know, you can hear me laughing still, because I think it is one of those things that's natural. My body still wants to deflect it. But that was a big moment. And a lot of those people no longer speak to me, the people that were there. And there is, I think, something that I think sticks out to me is, I think my experience with religion anyway, is that it's very attractive to be certain about things. And it feels very safe to be really certain about things. And I was a religious studies minor, but I think most people I know who have really emphatic opinions have never read the text that they're so emphatic about or dogmatic about. But I think it's like it's a fear whenever it breaches into your realm of certainty. And whenever you're breaching into somebody's like scary zone, there's no listening that happens. And it's very much just like, this is law. I have no reason as to like why it is law, but it is law. And that type of environment makes it feel impossible to have conversations or ask any questions ever. So I guess my bringing that up is just, I felt unseen, but also I felt like there was no opportunity for discourse about ideas that were anybody's other ideas. And that's like a whole other component to it that I think it's helpful to address, and just to be like, oh, including everybody. Like, I feel like the more we can come to terms with like, oh, people can have different ideas and that's okay, the more we can have conversations. But that doesn't seem to be existent in a lot of extreme religious cultures. It is existent in some, I will say that. There's an exception. There are some exceptions that I've been lucky enough to interact with, but they're very, 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 very rare. Yeah, I kind of went on a tangent, but is that resonating with folks, or does that make sense? Or yeah.
I think that speaks to the importance too of sometimes when we talk about normalization and being seen, we can think of it as like, I think this sort of intersects between, is it our responsibility as individuals? But I think it speaks to also why it's very important that we have representation in media, in our curricula, et cetera, so that it isn't necessarily the individual of all five of us to rehash each trauma we had, but instead it's like, like I'm telling everybody because I loved it and I sob at every episode. I've watched it twice. Heartstopper is an important show on Netflix, right? It's cute, queer love story, but like, so is any queer story anywhere, right? I had Will and Grace and I was already 12 or whatever, those things help spread that around. And so it is important to also really get that representation up because of this fact that a lot of people end up in the whole town is the infrastructure that doesn't see you. I mean, it's every element of your life. So I just wanted to make a plug for both Heartstopper, but also representation in media.
Yeah. I want to throw She-Ra into the mix too. And growing up, it was Xena, which wasn't very like super clear on it, but it was enough to save me.
I love Xena. That's a story about like talk about blindside and ignorance. I absolutely loved, regrettably now, Hercules, because Kevin Sorbo was a bit of a jerk. But Xena, I super, super loved, and it's funny because moving forward now, flash forward, seeing like the iconic, they're an iconic sort of like early lesbian couple, and people talk about, there was messaging and it was clear as day. I'm continually astonished at the things that just went right over my head. And it wasn't just because I was adolescent. Like, people will bring up like movies or shows or things and be like, oh yeah, the messaging, it was, the whole, even when people say it, it's not just like in terms of like Joel Schumacher as Batman and Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, which wasn't like people weren't making a leap. Joel said like, I put like messaging in there. Nothing. That would be an example of heterosexism. I never even questioned it. I didn't see anything aberrant about like the nipples and the zoom-ins on the butt suits. And just, I was like, whoa, who doesn't want to know the suit's got nipples? Like, it makes sense. Like,
so something current right now about sexuality and puberty and the fact that like when you're going through those stages, you kind of, the urges start at a certain time or they don't, right? But that movie Turning Red, I have to bring it up because my own mom was like, you can't let your kids watch that. Like, she's underneath the bed and you can tell she's going at herself or whatever. She's writing in a notebook. Like, it may have been hinted at, but it's not that extreme. And at the same time, my son is like 9. He's going to be there soon. He doesn't have an interest yet that I notice. So I still leave that door open. Like, is there any person? Is there anybody? Or I let him bring it to me. And so like I have that kind of language. Whereas my youngest, oh my gosh, she's girl crazy already. But the fact for like parents to be like, you can't expose your kids to this and you can't allow them to see that. Yes, you can. Like, yes, you can.
Yeah, I guess that goes back to a representation question, which I kind of actually wanted to bring up for everyone here. Do you all remember, and this is also based on the Xena thing, like, can you remember sort of your earliest sort of something that, whether it's that's me or just helped you sort of think of like, there's an other universe out there than Harry met Sally, as it were, in this case? Does that ring a bell for anyone?
Well, I remember when I was a little kid.
Got nothing.
Well,
in the hallway of the living room, watching my older sister and my mom watch Queer as Folk and just being floored. I had no idea what I was looking at, and then rewatching it after moving to Chicago in my 20s and being like, oh wait, I forgot all these characters exist. This explains a whole lot about things. So that for sure was Queer as Folk was one of the first ones. I mean, it's horrible. Don't get me wrong. That's not endorsement of the show in any way, but definitely where it's like, what's happening? What is this? And so that was a big one for me.
Anyone else can think of anything that at least just open your mind and be like, oh, maybe there's more to it than just that.
I mean, I think I was lucky. I grew up in theater and everything, and my mom was always really open about LGBTQ+, and I knew all types of sexualities when I was like, a little kid. So I was never really shielded from that. I think I was lucky growing up with the mom I had in that aspect. So we watched Will and Grace when I was a kid. Like we would watch it together as a family and things like that. So I got really excited when you said Will and Grace. But yeah, I was lucky, I guess.
But that counts. Yeah, some people unfortunately get stifled early, but I mean that early exposure. Look, that's what a lot of this legislation stuff out there is terrified of. Is like the false belief that that it's seeing a piece of content is going to create the thing in you, but seeing something that you can that opens your mind would really just help you recognize, right? It's not creating something.
No.
That wasn't
and it helps to have that conversation, and then it gives you that adult support. Like you can sit there, like you did with your mom, and you watched Will and Grace, and you can ask those questions, and then she opens her heart to whatever you might be unsure about, or whatever you might be developing or struggling to understand.
I mean, I guess. Go on, Sean.
I was just gonna say, I mean, and because I grew up in a very supportive family. I was very fortunate in Alabama to grow up among some of the few remaining progressives across the state down there. But you never know what it's going to be. So it wasn't like, oh, I saw Queer as Folk and I left out of the closet, right? I didn't come out of the closet until after I moved to Chicago. So there can be an internalized situation as well. So you have to have support built in as many places as you can find it, because you don't know what the one support system is going to be or the combination that's going to work to make it safe. So it isn't just one trick of like, oh, as long as the parents are cool with it, that's all we need, right? The door can be opened in a number of different ways. And so I think that's a really important nuance to pick up on.
And I love that you brought that up, because, I mean, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but even just the idea of arriving at saying this is who I am is not a linear or smooth process. And I mean, I think and again, going back to the sort of heterosexism, I never even thought about it, fine. But I also grew up in a semi-enlightened belief that there was only coming out of the closet if you were gay, and that that was it. So the whole idea of spectrum of there's more than just gay, lesbian, and bisexual. Even the word was a real learning thing for me in my late teens. I'd never even. I think somebody described themselves as demisexual, and I was like, this is right along the lines of Jianna. I heard the word demi, and where my head went to was, I thought they were describing themselves as a Wiccan kind of thing. Like I heard demi, so I thought God. It was some sort of religious, spiritual thing, and I was like, oh, that's cool, and didn't want to ask any questions because I didn't want to look ignorant. And I mean, I guess that's kind of the point I'd put in there is there isn't any sort of one particular moment, but can you recall was it a hard reckoning for you, or was it an easy coming out, or would you even describe a point as you came out, or was it kind of you woke up one day and it was all right, and then that was it? There's no announcement. You just kept going. Anyone?
I do.
I mean, mine was
We just go one by one.
Yeah. So sorry, Marlo. I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Okay.
If you don't have anything.
That's fine. Okay. It's okay. So my coming out experience took approximately 25 years. And obviously when I was a kid, no, right, I didn't know anything. But as soon as I started getting older, I knew something was different. Like I knew it. And then I did a year in Chicago school. I'm from Mexico. And I met somebody who was bisexual. And I was like, what the hell? What does this mean? Like I was like 12 years old, 13 years old at this point. I was like bisexual. And she had like colored hair. And I was like, what is this world that they're speaking of? But it was only like a 4-month thing that I knew this person for, and we didn't really get along. So it was just like, now I have this question in the back of my brain that there are bisexual people, but what does this mean? And then going back to like my mom's super Christian house and all these things. And then when I was like 18, I spoke about some mental health stuff that was going on with me, with my dad, and they sat me down and got me a little tipsy, honestly, is the Mexican way. And they were like, what's your sexuality? And I was like, well, I think I'm bisexual. I was still, like 18, 19. And my dad had a crisis because he thought that I was having a mental health crisis because I was queer instead of just the separation of the things. So not to make the story super long, but finally I moved to Chicago when I was 22. And that was still a long process, because I lived with family first and stuff. So it was just like, I was in the music community when I was in Mexico, which is a whole other topic, and there was barely even any women, much less any queer people, mostly in 2010, 2012. So when I moved here, it was just this like overwhelming love, honestly, once I started going to Boys Town and all of these things and kind of like starting meeting people and seeing how different of an experience it was. I did have the really good opportunity to go to some really amazing like bars in Mexico that were queer, which is not everyone's experience since there's not as many as you can find like in Chicago. But one day I wrote a letter to my mother. She's very Christian. And I wrote her a really beautiful letter that even had links and, different things for her to go and look into the different things I was talking about. I didn't hear of my mother for like 2 months after that. But now, I mean, everyone's going to take it. I think I finally got to a point where, I don't know if any of you watch Steven Universe, but Steven Universe sings a little song that says, I don't need you to love me, I love me. I don't need you to respect me, I respect me. But I want you to know that if you want to get to know me, you can. And I think that's like to the point I got, in my experience of just being like, yo, I'm here. Like, but I'm not going to change. Like, this is who I am and I'm here. And if you like it and if you're going to love that, like, I'm here. But if you don't, like, I don't need that. And it's honestly been really helpful. I also just started, I'm almost done. But I started using this kind of, I'm going to call it technique with my parents where I don't really say anything. I hinted, I don't hide anything. But I wait until they ask me. And my dad was like, why didn't you tell me that you were in a relationship, blah, blah, whatever. I was like, Dad, because I know I'm ready for the things that are happening in my life because, well, they're happening in my life. But you are in a different generation. You are going through your different like questionings in your own life. And like, you tell me when you're ready. You ask me, I'm always going to tell you the truth. But if you come and ask me, then I know that you're ready to hear the answer. And before that, I don't know. And I can't deal with the rejection of my parents anymore because I say things that you're not like comfortable with. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Did anyone else feel comfortable wanting to talk about sort of the coming out process? Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm still coming out. I think it's kind of perpetual for me. I have told my family, and my more immediate family chooses still not to believe it. I'm with somebody, my partner, who is, we look pretty heterosexual from the outside, but we're both queer and open in a relationship. And that comes with great privilege and great loneliness because sometimes you feel like you're between communities or you get backlash from many sides of people saying that you're not legitimate or you don't know what you like or who you are. But it comes out in like weird ways. Like my partner paints their nails and then they're like, oh, like that's so gay. And we're like, yeah, but like also that's the wrong term. And also that's homophobic. And then they're like, oh, but like we love people. And it's like, oh, but it comes out in these like weird sort of passive aggressive acts of violence that are just not okay. And to be honest, it's a daily navigation of like, how much can we be around this? We've been honest. When I'm in Ohio, I am very careful with who I tell and how I tell people, just because it can be very physically unsafe. In Chicago, I agree, Marlo. It feels lovely to be part of communities, but to be honest, I still sometimes, because of the way my partner and I have our relationship set up, I'm still told, even in Chicago, that I'm not legitimate, and that like I'm actually a lesbian, or I'm actually like straight, or I don't know what I like, and like pansexual isn't a thing. Like that's still something that like I've noticed I've encountered in Chicago at least once a year. So I'm still coming out, and it's definitely, I didn't have a moment. I think honestly, in some ways it'd be nice, because I do like it better when people know the details of me, because it just in many ways feels safer in that respect of like, you know who I am, and you can choose to interact or you can choose not to. But the process of getting there is exhausting and sometimes unsafe. So it's very tricky to navigate. I think it's not easy.
Thank you for sharing that. And there's a certain privilege when you can feel 1,000% safe in the coming out process, the questioning process. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate, even nowadays, that still can be a physically dangerous process for people. Sean, you've elaborated a little bit or articulated in your coming out. Jianna, I don't know if you wanted to just put a button right on it. Talk about it.
I think what's interesting is, so it took me a long time to come out, even though I was surrounded by relatively supportive, systems in the 90s and early 2000s. And in rural Alabama, I think I had the most supportive system you could come up with out of that equation. But it took me living in Chicago for a long time to get fully comfortable with it. And it was terrifying. It was scary, something I wrestled with for a long time. But I think what's interesting is sort of thinking about, so now I've been in a relationship with my partner for 6 years, and we're both 6'2", 6'3". We both probably, I'm not going to disclose his weight or my weight, I guess, but we're a lot of person coming at you. We're big people. So like you see us coming no matter what. And we cannot be conspicuous when we're out. And that has led to a lot of interesting things where, well, I'm out, I know what I'm doing. But suddenly when I'm with Gregory, my partner, it's like, yeah, when we're driving back, he's from Tennessee, I'm from Alabama. If we drive home, it's like, okay, well, this gas station, let's see what happens here. Or if we stop anywhere in town that isn't in family zone, it's like, well, people are going to know we're gay, and that's a new experience than when I had just come out and was then having, I could sort of jump back, not necessarily back into the closet or anything, but it's like, well, I'm not going to wander up and just, hi, I'm gay, I'd like gas. I would just buy my gas and leave. So it continues to make me aware of the fact that it's like, I think the feeling of unsafeness, or at least anxiety causing situations are way more prevalent still in the United States than I think a lot of people realize. And has been eye-opening for me in our 6 years we've been together, where it's just like, damn, I can't believe that still I feel like that little tinge of like, ooh, you're doing something wrong, or ooh, this is, you should be nervous, watch out, what's going to happen. And until we get in front of that, it's hard to fully come out, right? So I feel like I'm still in that process too.
That's good. Thank you. And again, thank you for sharing. And like going around the wheel, Jessica, you talked about it. You said you kind of knew, but I don't know if you wanted to sort of double down on the sort of coming out.
Yeah, I can talk on it. I think, being asexual, I am very privileged that I don't have politics or religion really going against me. So I can't really speak to that aspect of it, but I can say that, like, for me personally, I've never really felt the need to come out. It's more of like one of those, oh, didn't you know type of things. So I'm very actively like on my social medias and with my family and stuff. I'm very open about it when the subject comes up. And I've been more active with it on social media because I get a lot of people who are excited to see a content creator and an author who's openly asexual. And my character in my book is also asexual, fun fact. I don't think there was ever really a time where I felt the need to come out. And I honestly do get surprised when my friends just like know. And I don't know why, because I am open about it. But I was literally having a conversation with a friend the other day, and they're just like, so how does being asexual work anyway? And I was like, you knew? Like, I don't know. So I think I'm very privileged in that aspect, that I don't have really feel the need to have like come out and be stressed or scared of it, because like I said, I don't have politics or religion in the mass majority of our society that are going to be upset or angry about it, because it's very different just not being sexually attracted to anybody as opposed to being attracted to whatever other sexuality you are. So I am very privileged in that aspect. But I've never really come out. I'm just like act like it's something people are supposed to know about me. That's just how I do it. So
No, and I appreciate that, because again, these are very, very much very unique and individual dynamics. And again, it goes back to like on the heterosexism side of it, that people take that for granted. You'll see this in dialogue of like, well, what was the day you sat down and realized you were straight? And a lot of people will take that for granted. We're like, well, I just knew, but you never had to hesitate to think about or talk about it or navigate outbound communication.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I think in all parts of the spectrum, it's powerful for you to feel comfortable to share that. We keep coming back to it, or it keeps having an intersection. So I kind of want to just talk about the religion and faith side of things, which is, that's a very specific avenue. Do you, for especially because Marlo and Kate, you've highlighted it particularly. Sean, I don't know. I don't want to presume that Alabama equates. I could imagine that the church is in play there, but I don't want to. Would you say?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That's a God-fearing people in Alabama.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Didn't want to assume. But okay. So now that it's in play, just want to sort of pick on this scab for a while. Did any of you, you grew up with it, I presume. So did any of you have to navigate like keeping your religion, losing your faith, or was it kind of, did you feel like it's one or the other? Like I said, I don't want to put this in too much of a box. And if there's no volunteers, I'm going to pick on somebody. But
well,
hey, Sean.
I was raised. Yeah, sometimes I'm this big talker. I was, raised Catholic in Alabama, which was unusual in our little town. My mother was actually, so I'm ethnically Jewish on her side, and so that was even more unusual down there. But we weren't practicing Jews. But then, so the Catholicism thing was already seen. Our understanding was more of like the social justice, care for others. Obviously, a lot of that's been vacated, and it was difficult. As part of the coming out was sort of like a reckoning with, well, I'm not really going to be super Catholic anymore. But it was interesting when I came to Chicago. I realized I have a cousin here who's a rabbi who is in a same-sex relationship, in a marriage and stuff. So he's been a big source of just interesting where I'm not converting to Judaism either, but it's been an interesting process of, I think Unitarian Universalists are a good example. I mean, there are faiths in Chicago that I know are welcoming, but I will say in Alabama, I'm not as familiar in rural, smaller towns. I don't think you have quite as much religious infrastructure that's open and welcoming. So I think it's a major concern. Yeah.
I hear you on that. Marlo?
So I grew up again in Mexico, so very Catholic, small-ish city. Like small for maybe compared to Chicago, but not that small, like in Mexico. And then very Christian at home. I honestly don't remember even the awareness of like queerness until I was very old. Like I have two uncles on my dad's side and stuff, but it was never openly talked about to me. Like I still remember my mom having conversations with my dad about like how he couldn't show me any like secular, I think it's what it's called, of the world music or media or anything, because I could get like contaminated, because I was a kid. This is not the queerest, but it's for any queer people, I think you'll relate of why this is adjacent. But one day I saw a DVD. Well, I didn't know it was a DVD. I thought I saw a Barbie. I was so excited. I thought I was getting a gift, and I take it out, and it was not a Barbie. It was the DVD of Cher when she has like the wig, the I don't know if it's a wig. I don't know why I said a wig, but like blonde hair. And I just remember being like, what is this, Dad? And it was like one of the few, like the first things that he showed me that were not like secular. And I was like, this is amazing. Cut to now that it's like a very big part of like the queer community, but it was also like this part of me like getting out of like the church. And honestly, I think I started questioning like the church very, very young. And questioning like the systems mostly because my mom got married when I was like 15, and before that she was never like seen at church. Like it was like she was just this like church goer, and as soon as she got married she was like into a white man. She was like part of like all of like the main activities, and like she was like hosting all of these things and doing all these things. So that made me question a lot. So I think that personally it wasn't per se that like me realizing that I was queer was like, oh, I should separate myself from church, or am I going to have to separate, or like that created a problematic. It was more like all of the different things that I was realizing that were just not congruent, were not okay, we're not human. Like, you know, like, how to say it? Like empathetic, like, you know, like all of these like things that they were carrying as fake love when it's actually just so much hatred and fear. And it was more that I think they realized like, I'm tired of being afraid all the time. Like I already have so many stupid irrational fears like bees and needles and all these things. I don't need all of these other fears like hell that I can actually like, I can see a bee, I can't see hell. So like I'm out here gonna worry about the bees and stop worrying so much about things that are not proven or really real at all to me. So yeah, that's.
Thank you for sharing that.
For me it was I was drinking the Kool-Aid pretty hard as a younger kid, like up through 18. I was homeschooled. I was in a very small bubble. I was doing theater, which I genuinely think saved my life. It was definitely community, but it was, I think for me, which we've talked about something collectively a couple times, and I just want to address it as a reality for me too, is I think there's a huge belief, at least from the community that I come from, that like if you're introduced to narratives or ideas that changes you, as opposed to like you being innately who you are. I've been this way since I was born. I didn't have verbal skills to be able to address it until I had language in my world to address it. So, but physically and emotionally, I've been pansexual my whole life. So it's interesting. Yeah, because I think like when sexual awakening was becoming a thing, I was very lucky in that sexuality was so repressed, we never talked about it. So I think I got away from a lot of the things that I'm a naturally sexual person. So I think I got away from a lot of the things that keep people from experiencing sexuality in general when they're coming out of religion. So like, again, I had girlfriends, but we didn't call each other girlfriends. I was emotionally connected to people in a way that was a dating relationship without having the verbal language to address that, because that wasn't a safe language to use. So through the ages up to 18, going to college, I didn't have a lot of educational exposure either. You know, it was very much like creation was taught for my science classes. Math was considered like not even that great. So it was very much like school was the first opportunity I had, even though it was a conservative school, to question ideas. So in college, I had a pretty big reckoning of like all these people I love, and myself included, it doesn't make sense that they're going to hell if this is indeed a loving God. And I was learning Hebrew and Greek at the time, and I was like, a lot of the language that says that gay people aren't welcome in the church isn't actually translatable in that way anyway. So even if you're using the logic of religion against religion, people didn't want to hear it. And I agree, it's a fear-based mentality. And then I started looking at the history of it, and I'm like, this is just a tool that governments have used against people to control them for years. And I think that fear, that generational fear, has been handed down. Now, that being said, I do have a lot of friends who have stayed with the church and have communities and are openly in the LGBTQ plus community, and the communities are embracing of that. And I have a couple friends who are part of the parsonage and part of politics that are very open, but they're very, very rare. And that rarity to me, I just didn't want to be a part of it anymore. It just felt like most of what I loved and what I am wasn't loved in that community. And to be honest, like I think I was talking with Marlo before the show started, of like, I love stories now that talk about chosen family. And it's very scary because there's not like a social obligation to be with your chosen family. You know, people can leave. And, you know, that was very hard. So all that to say is that when I was letting go of my religion, it very much was an emotional break. It was really hard. And I think my family still thinks that's because of ex-partners or people that I was friends with. And that's hard too. But yeah, so all that to say, I just want to acknowledge that if anybody's listening and it's hard for them, it is really hard. And if you're learning about these conversations or having them for the first times, it is scary. And just because you don't know things, it doesn't mean you're not intelligent. I think learning that was a really big thing for me to be able to grow in like my intellectual understanding of the world, and to be able to expand out of the small bubble that I originated in. Yeah, that's.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. And you know, this kind of leads me to sort of moving into sort of a home stretch thing, is that we started with, well, on the face of it, one of the things like allyship, we're not going to talk about allyship because we're talking about you all, but one of the things that I notice a lot, and why I started talking with Jianna, for instance, is a lot of people are just terrified to have any conversations. And again, I go back to the sort of heterosexism thing. Terrified to have any conversations because they don't know where to begin, and there can be a fear of like, are we just turning somebody into a guinea pig? And we say, tell me about this, tell me about that, tell me what this means to you. But I would be really interested to know like where you are in life, and do you think it's possible to keep people in your life? I'm not talking about toxic and hostile people, but do you think it's possible to keep people in your life who maybe just don't endorse or understand or care about the reality of orientation? You know, I'm not talking about someone who's like hostile and make you feel unsafe. Obviously, fuck that person. But like, you know, somebody who's like, well, look, hey, you know what? I think it's just your imagination. You're watching too much. You're watching way too much this, that, and the other. But you do you, and I'll do mine, and we can talk about sports or any. I'm just, you know what I mean? Like, what do you think about that? For instance, like just in all of your followers, 2 million on TikTok, for instance.
Yeah.
It's amazing if everyone is like 1,000% on board. But like, let's say you go to a convention and somebody meets you and is like, hey, well, I think ace is total BS, or is ace pejorative? Sorry, is asexual? It's total bullshit. But like, you're great, and I love your book. And well, maybe that sounds good because you don't have to keep it in your life, but you know where I'm going with it.
I have a high tolerance for that at this point because of all the hate comments I get. That sounds awful,
Okay.
but yeah, there are people who don't support aspects of things I do. I don't think it's ever, been my sexuality. And like I said earlier, I'm just very privileged in that aspect of it. But I kind of have the mindset. It's like, you don't have to like agree, but at least respect me about it. And be respectful. Like if it's not something you want to agree with, just be respectful. Don't sit there and badmouth it. Don't say it's stupid. Don't say anything like that. Just be respectful and move on with your day. That's how I am when it comes to that type of stuff. And I've always been like that. Like if you feel the need to say something mean to somebody in any form, way, shape, or form, or comment on somebody's video, something negative, like why? Just why? And what are you gaining from that? What are you gaining? Be respectful. Just be respectful is that's what I'm gonna pound in there. Be respectful. If you don't agree with somebody's viewpoint. Especially if it's one that's not harming you personally, if that makes any sense. I think that makes sense.
Heck yeah, no, I dig that. Anyone else want to jump in on that, Marlo?
I would say pretty much the same thing. It's just boundaries. Like I've gotten to a point in my personal experience with my mom where we only text, because whenever I start talking about anything about my life, it's just like, oh, disgrace, dissolution, and this or that. And I'm just like, dude, I'm done. Like, honestly, I love you with all my heart, but I'm done. Like, if you want to text me one of this, and that way, if she sends me, a homophobic video, or not homophobic, but, a Christian video that kind of gives that vibe, or a text that says I'm praying for you to get a husband or whatever, I can just delete it and forget about it, and then I just pretend it didn't happen. But it's safer for me personally. So I think for me the thing is like finding those like boundaries with people, like how far am I okay with going, right? Like my grandma probably will never understand pansexuality. That's fine. She doesn't need to. Like, you know, unless I find someone of a different gender or something, I'm never going to have to explain it to her. So really finding those boundaries, one with myself of like, when do I feel the need to explain these things or to, you know, be open about these things, but also like, at which point am I going to say no? Like, this is not the point. And for me, I'd always say like with people out there, like, ask, you know, like if you have a question, like a legitimate nice, you know, question about stuff, ask me and I'll tell you. I'm super open at this point. Like I'll tell you I'm not going to answer this, Google it, and just also don't take it personally if that's the answer, or I'll tell you about it if that's like where I'm at in the moment, you know. So I think it's all about really boundaries and creating our own boundaries without depending on anyone, and if they want to respect them, or if they obviously respect would be the very much the goal, as you said, but yeah, that's kind of my stance now.
Yeah, I'd be good. Sean?
I do. I mean, for me, yeah, it's a. I think we're about to have this fight in this country in this decade over gay marriage, and so there's a part of it where I'm sort of back in space, like you don't think, you know, I don't need you to. It's not your choice to tell me I'm gay. So you don't. It's not. There's not a respectful way to approach me. You can either acknowledge that is what I am, or you can go to hell. So there's sort of, that's my attitude on it. And so it's like, you don't think I should get married? That's not a respect question. I don't think you should get married, right? So there's that sort of immediate, just like, no. It's you need to see me as a human, and I will see you as a human. But I'm not at a current state of really allowing like close family if you need to do that. But I think you got to keep pushing that conversation to be your authentic self as much as you can. Because yeah, it's similar to suicide prevention. You know, it's stigma. People don't want to talk about it sometimes, and it's just like a little hammer that keeps hitting at you until eventually it breaks you. So, you know, I think you really, for me, it's pretty important that we not tolerate less than what heteronormative or heterosexist people get. You know, the perspective on it, where it's like, well, everybody accepts straight people. I'm not any different. That's what I want, and I will accept no less than the exact same as equal rights would call for under the Constitution. So. But I'm very, it's 9, I'm all worked up. So yeah, but that for me, it's I expect equal rights. Yeah.
Don't apologize. It's you, baby. That's great.
No, as I hear you all talking, I feel really angry. Like it makes me really mad. And a lot of that too, like that whole like token person, like the person with lived experience, the person who you need to go to, like that's not on you to educate the whole world. Like yes, it's a part of it, but at the same time I need to educate myself. So it goes back to kind of what we talked about in a previous panel. Like if you are seeking help and if you do need some of those resources, like ask those questions. Have you worked with somebody who identifies as pansexual? Have you, or who is pansexual? Have you ever experienced a small town, very secluded area, and then somebody who's broken away from that? Like ask those hard questions to meet your needs. And then on my same end, like as a clinician, I need to make sure that I'm educating myself to be able to address that. And I need to be honest with myself and with whoever's sitting in front of me to say like, wow, I really haven't. If you're comfortable with it, we can move on. I'm willing to work with you. I'm willing to find out. But at the same time, it makes me really mad.
That's fine. That's a natural emotion. It's good to have. Kate, how do you sort of see? You've articulated a little bit on it already, but like, I mean.
Yeah, I don't know. It's different on a yearly basis for me. I love the visual of the hammer, Judd. And also I think too, so much of it is our social emotional learning. Like if we're not, I don't think we as humans naturally know how to respect each other or treat each other as humans. And I think that's why organizations like Helix or like having Sean are really exciting, because you know, it was a learning curve for me to be able to talk to people with respect and to disagree about their opinions, because I was raised to have the superior opinion. and you come into the conversation, you listen politely, but you know you're right. Like that was the environment in which I was raised. And I agree. I think my situation is similar to Marlo's. I have pretty strong boundaries, and like I know how to respectfully say like I can't be in that world right now, and I'm not vulnerable, which means, you know, you can't really have a relationship without vulnerability. And so yeah, but also, I mean, I call bullshit on anybody who doesn't want a relationship with their parents, like on an animalistic level, or with their close family. So it's really, really hard. Yeah, that's where I'm at with it.
Oh, I love that, and I think the relationship thing and how each of you navigates our forbearance and what is acceptable in your environment is also really important for people, if you're watching right now or you engage this content at a later time, to understand, just as I said at the top of the episode, this isn't linear discussions. There's no script for these kind of, this isn't, we're done with the debate about like, well, should you have the right to exist or not? And please tell people, define yourself. But this isn't a linear discussion in terms of like what makes up you, what fills you, everything from coming out to the adversities or maybe staticness of your experiences. It should help you, if you're listening now or in a later date, be able to appreciate that your resources, what's going to work and support you, doesn't have to fit somebody else's journey. Okay, you can draw inspiration, you can enjoy visibility from shared experiences, but ultimately the real timetable for your own mental health is going to be doing things that fit your comfort and your sense of fulfillment. And whether that includes having certain friends, family members, faith, no faith, putting terms, whether you think it's labeling or you don't think there's such a thing as labeling, it's your right and discretion to adopt, embrace, reject those things. And when we talk about orientation as a broad concept and pushing back against bias, being aware, the most powerful tool for awareness is being able to feel comfort for your agency. Comfort for your agency doesn't mean you have to go out every day rocking a flag, but that also means you don't have to be meek as a mouse about it either. And as we wind down this conversation, because there's no perfect beginning, middle, or end to these things, I also want to honor something that, again, I feel so blessed to hear insight from all of you. And remembering that orientation is a part of the human experience, but it's not all it is, but it can be a deep part of it. I kind of want to wind down with a little discussion point about something that I'm inspired to ask from an associate of mine, Alexandria Hoffman, the executive director of Sound Mind Music, who often asks, where's your head, where's your heart in this moment in time? And that's, take that as philosophical or specific as you want. But I just kind of want to go around the space here and ask that question. Jianna, where's your head? Where's your heart?
My heart is with you, and my heart is with the network for facilitating such wonderful conversation. And with our panel, like the four of you have contributed to my personal growth to love you even more. Like, I know this is this first time I've met some of you, but at the same time, like, I'm with you, and my head is still moving forward. Like, I still have more learning to do. So my heart's with you and my head's still going.
Thank you very much. Kate, where your head, where your heart at?
My head's pretty angry. It's like, and a little hopeless and numb. I see growth, and sometimes it helps to like read books that talk about like a person's experience over their life. Like I really like Gloria Steinem's out of My Life on the Road, just because I'm like, oh yeah, like it takes a life to move an inch, but then now seeing all these things move back, it's just got me very angry and hurt and frustrated. And I'm not normally angry, so it's new for me. So I'm navigating, like, I think it's healthy to be angry, and I'm navigating learning that. My heart, I love, I think you said it so beautifully, Jianna. Like my heart is with all of you. My heart is with the people I meet on a daily basis who I think are creating a beautiful community in a grassroots way, with organizations like Helix and the network. And that does give me hope. My better days, I'm like, oh yeah, there's still sparks of that, and that's beautiful, and I'm excited about that.
Thank you, Katie. Jess?
Yeah. My head is honestly in 50 different places right now, but that's just how it's been all week. But my heart, I think, first of all, my heart is with the Texas shooting victims, for one, their friends and family, for one. But also, just with, I think with the discussion today, I think it was a really good discussion, and my heart does go out to all of you guys, because you guys are, living, a life that I'll never have to, struggle with. And I really do feel you guys for that. And realizing how privileged, I have it over here. So, yeah, that's kind of where my heart is today. So, yeah.
Thank you, Jess. Sean?
So I think my head is, in a very active oriented space right now. How do we organize? How do we keep moving forward? How do we play defense in the 2020s potentially, but as we and take our wins where we can get them, and acknowledge that we have made a lot of progress. I think that's where I'm kind of am after this 2.5 hours. I think my heart, coming on here to discuss suicide prevention and LGBTQ spaces, anytime I do anything with AFSP, my heart always goes back to my sister and just everyone who's ever, struggled with suicidal ideations, who has ever survived the loss of anyone in their network or a loved one to suicide. That's why all of us AFSP volunteer and work together. It's why I've been doing this for years. And so for me, it's grateful that I get to have that memory and feeling it close to my sister after doing something like this. So it's very appreciative, Carl, and the rest of the panelists too. This has just been wonderful, and I'm just so happy that the network is here. So
thank you so much, Sean. Marlo?
I think I have to agree with a couple of you that my head is a little bit everywhere. I think it's a fight between this anxiety of things are getting so much worse, but then at the same time, there's like hope of like, yeah, but things are also getting better. But there's just so much of it, and like not only outside, right, but in our personal lives as well. So there's just so many different things, and that's just like the queer stuff. I'm not even gonna get started on what's inside this ADHD head by any means. We don't want to be here for another 3 hours.
Feel that,
but my heart, I think it's with humanity as a whole, and Mother Nature and the universe and our souls, just trying to, I think we're in a point of just so much pain, and we're trying to hold on to something and to connect to each other in such like desperation in a way, but so many of us don't have those tools. And I think that my heart is also in that middle place of like feeling that pain with, like mother, as a spiritual person, with like Mother Nature and stuff, and like feeling, the pain of everything that we're putting each other through, but at the same time, that like hope and like that love for all of us, including the people in this panel, the people watching us, of we are literally the answer of everything, for each other. And I just hope we can find ways to see that more in each other.
Thank you so much. And I was expecting that. I want to thank all of our panel guests, and I want to thank you who are watching tonight. When I think of where's the head and where's the heart, as we're winding down tonight, my head and heart are a little bit unified. It's the history major, but it's also the sort of being committed to doing the work of the network. This rounds out I've been, by volunteer or by paid, I've been committed in the social and mental health spaces for nearly 20 years. And where my head is actually echoing anger. But It's an anger in terms of an activist's furnace, in that, yes, it's the violence that we've seen. Actually, Texas, but over the last 10 days, the California shootings, the Buffalo shootings as well, things that are going on in Ukraine and the other injustices that are happening in America and places like that. This all feels scary. And I mean, just the universe, the world, all feels scary. And it is so easy and so innate and organic to feel hopeless, to feel powerless and helpless about what's going on. And I'm going to say something, because toxic positivity is toxic. Just saying, oh, well, it'll get better, and don't worry, and put your head to it. That sucks, okay? And people are just saying blindly, that sucks. It doesn't help. If you are overwhelmed, that's not your imagination, and don't gaslight yourself on that. Take your breaks, put the phones down, blah, 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 disengage, and hold space for yourself to process, and just hug yourself and your loved ones. When I talk about negative positivity, is because I want you to understand this. The worst degradations of our society, and I'm just going to speak exclusively for America, the worst degradations in America did not last forever, but they didn't last forever because of a group of individuals united and willing to sort of put their effort into it. And a really terrible thing to say is that change to disrupt, defy, and overcome the worst nature of our human being has cost lives before. And it shouldn't cost the lives it's costing now. But I just want to point out to people that I'm always of the mindset of I won't go quietly into the darkness. And I can't speak for others, but where my head wraps itself around a lot of the seeming inhumanity and degradations, my heart feels ablaze with hope, because it's not fatalist. And the changes that ultimately come and the things that make things better doesn't happen by a magic wand or by guessing. It happens, unfortunately, fortunately, by people coming together and really pushing hard. And it's ballot hard, it's marching hard. Sometimes it's volatile with fists hard, but it is always, and the answer has always been together, people together. And I don't care if that sounds corny. I'm not here to talk about toxic positivity. I'm just saying, as a point of fact, the reason I can always have hope is that I know together we can make things better. And that's just kind of a thing I'm leaving with tonight, is that I know together there is still hope for us. But I hope you all are being able to make space for yourselves. And that's where I want to leave it tonight. We're going to talk about violence next week more in depth, and talk about other things that are relevant. But the most relevant thing for you all tonight is yourselves and the people that you consider make up your family, your community, your network. Please give yourselves the grace to take time to just invest in your own well-being, especially in times like this, because we need all of you in this fight. So my guests, Sean, Jess, Kate, Jianna, and Marlo, you are wonderful, incredible human beings. Thank you for sharing your voices tonight. And everyone who's watching, commenting, participating, whether it is right now or you engage this content at a later date, thank you for giving us your time. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Take care and have hope.